All right, welcome back everyone to our virtual educational event. I'm Brett Norton from Beyond Clean, and before we get started with this next presentation, just a couple of housekeeping items. I'd like to call everyone's attention to the features on your screen. All of the windows that you see are movable, so feel free to shrink, enlarge, or move them around to make your event experience fit your preferences. On the lower left, you will see a Q&A window. Throughout each presentation, we encourage you to send in your questions for the speakers to answer during our Q&A session. We love questions, so please go ahead and feel free to send those in. In the upper right, you will see a resources window where you'll find additional resources to download and access all the resources that are provided to you by our event sponsor, Censis. Don't forget, you will also find free bonus CE content for today's conference in the resources window, along with instructions for downloading and accessing your CE certificate. One more thing is if you do have any issues with connectivity, if the screen freezes or you can't hear anything, simply refresh your browser and get back into the presentation. That often fixes the issue. So just something to think about while you're watching the presentation if anything happens. Our next speaker, Jacob Long, is a business development manager and sales engineer at Censis Technologies Incorporated. During his time with Censis, Jacob has taken part in a diverse range of products, including data optimization, product development validation, service trainings, and internal training developments. Jacob credits these experiences for his vast knowledge of sterile processing, the operating room suite, and operations and solutions at Censis. Jacob also has served in the U.S. Marine Corps as an avionics technician and quality assurance inspector. We thank him for his service. What are the benefits of tracking at the individual scope or asset level with a unique device identifier? Jacob is here to outline key industry standards and recommendations regarding high-level disinfection processing with a focus on asset-specific and instrument-level tracking such as Censis HLD solution, the ScopeTrac Advanced. Hear how asset-specific tracking helps mitigate challenges associated with point-of-use care utilization and reprocessing. This is one session you are not going to want to miss. Please join me in welcoming Jacob Long.
Hi, thank you for that, Brett. So good morning, everyone. As Brett did with that wonderful introduction, my name is Jacob Long, and I'm a sales engineer at Censis. To give you all just some background before I jump into this, in addition to what Brett said, I've been at Censis for just over 4 years, and I have been involved in quite a few different projects, from implementations to helping out our development team to supporting and developing the sales team as well. So I thank you all for your time this morning, and it's going to be a fun presentation. So what we're going to look at today is HLD management in conjunction with an instrument tracking solution, totally tracking down to each individual, HLD or flexible scope or semi-rigid scope, each individual scope, whatever that asset type might be. And we're going to look at how the recent changes to AAMI ST91, which came out in December, kind of correlate or align with what an instrument tracking system or solution like ScopeTrac Advanced from Censis can do for us, and also help us align and make sure that we're adhering to some of these new regulatory changes with things that came out just this last December. Let me go ahead and get started here. Yep. So as far as our objectives today, this one's going to be pretty quick. But what we're going to do first is I do want to have a discussion first about just the common challenges that a lot of us face whenever we're handling HLD assets, whether those are flexible scopes, semi-rigid scopes. The latest versions that came out in December also include TEE probes and things like that. So we're going to just first kind of have some quick discussions about the common things that pretty much all of us have to face if these are assets that we're responsible for reprocessing and utilizing. Then we're going to compare those challenges and look at how digitally tracking to each individual scope with various methods help us provide access to the IFUs for each one of these assets, which will then subsequently help us, reprocess everything correctly, safely, and efficiently. And then, of course, we're going to understand how that asset-specific tracking helps us mitigate the challenges that we discussed first, all the way from, point-of-use treatment through storage, reprocessing, cleaning, everything that has to go along with all of those challenges that we do face whenever we are responsible for reprocessing these delicate assets. And then lastly, we're also going to look at some maintenance strategies. That's another challenge that we're faced commonly with these because they're delicate. They're a little more easily damaged than a surgical steel instrument or something. So we're also going to close up and look at how an instrument tracking solution like ScopeTrac Advanced, for example, can help us also with the maintenance and repair, the loaning, all those processes associated when something does happen to one of our assets, as if it damaged something like that. And then just to give us a brief overview about AAMI ST91, once again, this version came out in December of this last year, and it completely replaced the 2015 version. That's something that I do want to make sure that we're all aware of. It's not an amendment, it's not an addendum. It is a complete displacement of 2015. So being familiar with the new changes at ST91 is important, especially going forward, and just realizing that it is a full displacement of the 2015 version. Something that's really valuable to know as well with how ST91 from this last December was put together, it was a joint effort as these guidelines usually are, but it did use quite a bit of federal data. It also used research and then of course just the expertise of the panel and the authors. So it's a pretty diverse range of information and data that's supporting the changes and all the things that were added, removed, or changed to the newest version of ST91. And a lot of that also, what we find differently here is, hold on, I'm seeing a question there. Audio is very fuzzy. Okay, I'll try to slow down, Kim. I appreciate that. If anyone else has any trouble hearing me, if you can just let me know, I'd be happy to slow down if that helps. But another big part of the changes that came to ST91, a lot of what went away was some of the rigid language. When we're reprocessing HLD assets, there's a lot of malleability as far as what type of scope it is, what type of asset it is, what we do to actually reprocess it. You have things, non-lumens, lumens, semi-rigid, flexible. There's a pretty diverse range of what these assets are, and with that comes a pretty diverse way to maintain and properly reprocess and handle each one of these. So another goal of the latest version of ST91 was to make it a little more malleable, make it a little more flexible for our interpretations. That way we can apply them more easily or a little more readily at our facilities instead of having rigid definitions for some of these things. A good example of that we'll talk about quite a bit is like point of use cleaning or pre-cleaning. For example, we're moving away from that because it's a little too simple. We'd rather just call it treatment because treatment, for point of use or point of care can mean a ton of different things depending on what that asset might be. So that's just one example of kind of a little more flexibility that we were kind of going for with this latest version. And just there on the right, just some high-level best topics that we're going to look at today is, first of all, that transition to sterilization. It's a big part of the latest version. If it can be sterilized, we're going to want to try to sterilize it as opposed to high-level disinfecting it. We're also going to consider high-risk endoscopes, what that means to be a high-risk endoscope, and how we need to be aware of how to handle those things. And then, like I just mentioned, point of use treatment, the difference between just calling it cleaning and calling it treatment and everything that goes along with that separation. There's also new recommendations for proper moisture adherence for transport, preparing these assets for transport. And then something that we'll call enhanced visual inspections. Visual inspections aren't anything new for us, but there are some new recommendations as far as how we should incorporate those visual inspections and when they should be incorporated. We're also going to talk a little bit about verifying our cleaning, the latest recommendations against manual disinfection, which is pretty data-driven. It's a pretty neat one for me. And then drying and storage is another high-level topic we'll discuss. So that's definitely not everything that's new in ST91 from December, but those are some of the biggest hitters, and those are certainly some of the ones that we're going to discuss this morning. I'm going to go through some obstacles now. So these are some of those common challenges that I was referring to earlier. If we're in a department or a facility that happens to handle and reprocess HLD assets, flexible scopes, semi-rigid scopes, probes, etc., odds are we're all faced or we're all encountering a lot of the same similar issues. I'm going to go through these kind of piecemeal so we can digest them and think about them. So once again, sterilization transition. If a scope can be sterilized, we're going to want to sterilize it. A lot of recent data is showing, of course, sterilization is more effective than high-level disinfection. We've run into challenges in the past based on the physical makeup of scopes. It was always difficult to, sterilize things that were lumened in low-temperature sterilizers and things like that. But with advances in the sterilization industry, as well as what more and more data is showing, we're definitely going to want to start moving to sterilization when we can for these scopes. Once again, if it can be sterilized, sterilize it. Another important thing to remember here, though, just like with a lot of this, I mean, this is the whole point that another ST91 completely displaced the previous one, is this is always an expanding area of research. That flexibility is coming back again. So while this is what the data is showing today, this is where the industry is going. I don't see this projection changing really, but this is certainly going to be an area that we're all going to want to pay attention to when it comes to properly sterilizing these assets when they're able to be sterilized. And then also high-risk endoscopes. Odds are if we're handling scopes in our facilities, we don't just have one model. We probably have a large variety of models to cover different types of procedures. So high-risk endoscope is going to be, what is that, right? So there's some criteria that Amy put together to determine what is a high-risk endoscope. There's not just one model or one type of scope that it is. It's going to be a combination of things that we can use to determine if something is a high-risk endoscope. So the first would be, is that scope type or model, does it have any association with any outbreaks, either regionally or internationally or anywhere continental? Is there any sort of outbreak association with that asset? And then, of course, difficulty processing. Once again, some scopes, non-lumen compared to a lumen scope with elevators and channels. There's a large variety of moving parts, how we process things based on our IFUs. So taking a step back and considering what we should consider a high-risk endoscope for our facilities and our inventories is a big part of that. And then, of course, there's the challenges with training. It's way different to reprocess, scope A than it is scope B. So it's important to identify these high-risk endoscopes, not just from the perspective of reprocessing it correctly, but making sure that we're reprocessing it safely and correctly and at how it should be according to the IFU, since we do see a large diversity in scope models. And then point of use treatment. This is always kind of a good one to talk about because in my experience, every facility varies a little bit as far as how we do this, as far as who's responsible for it, what those processes are in place. But what it all comes down to is treatment is going to be much more encompassing and allows us a lot more freedom in our facilities to write SOPs and establish procedures that ensure the most safety and efficiency. Because treatment isn't just cleaning, especially back to that scope diversity. Some scopes can have completely different types of point of use processes depending on what that scope is. So we do want to look at point of use from a completely different perspective. Cleaning is a little too simplified because it can be many more things than just cleaning. And then proper moisture for transport. This is one that's a little tricky, but what we definitely want to consider is whenever scopes, after they're used, we want to make sure that there's a proper level of moisture for transport. And it's kind of like that Goldilocks zone. We don't want to submerge them. We don't want to drown them as we transport them, but we also don't want them to get dry. So making sure that those are moist for transport is going to be a challenge for all of us. And then back to those visual inspections. What's the difference between a visual inspection and an enhanced visual inspection? And when should we incorporate those? So in the past, this really isn't something that's too new, but we should always be visually inspecting our scopes at every stage of this process. That should be something that's just best practice, making sure that we always have eyes on it. We're looking for crimps, we're looking for obvious damage, obvious misuse, things like that. But what we want to talk about as enhanced visual inspections is making sure that we incorporate at least once a more in-depth and much more enhanced standalone inspection. So this would be much more specific to the scope model, much more specific to that process. For example, using a boroscope or something to check inside. That's much different than just holding a scope and kind of glancing it once over to check for cracks or something. So in making sure that we involve visual inspections in addition to some enhanced visual inspections in our processes is going to be another change or challenge that we're all faced with. And then cleaning verification, making sure that what we've done is actually clean. So CV testing or cleaning verification is best practice, but it's also going to be something that we're going to want to incorporate for these scopes. Once again, always based on the IFU and what's best for this. But this is making sure that the cleaning that occurred did in fact, meet the criteria based on whatever that situation was. So making sure our chemicals were the right concentration, making sure if we do ATP tests that our readings are, within a proper threshold, things like that. And then a lot of that data-driven research that drove the latest version of ST91 also goes against manual disinfection. Most of the data is showing that we're going to want to start getting away from manual disinfection whenever possible and taking advantage of our AERs. What the data is showing is that AER reprocessing increases the level of cleanliness of these scopes. It's also going to ensure that our technicians are reprocessing and cleaning these properly. And once again, the data is really showing that we're going to want to step away from that manual cleaning. And then drying and storage are also some big changes. We've always dried and stored our scopes in the past, but what the new guidelines recommend and what the data is showing is that we need to be a little more involved with how these are being dried and stored, because we need absolute or complete dryness of these assets before they move on. So these 8 kind of just high-level topics here, I feel are all challenges that we all should consider when we're handling, HLD assets like scopes and semi-rigid scopes and things. If these are assets that we own, that we process, at least one of these, if not all of them, are going to be challenges that we're faced with. So now that we've identified some of those challenges, let's talk about how we can actually use a tracking system to help mitigate some of those. So when it comes to total tracking, making sure that we have eyes on each individual asset, and each individual asset is its own unique scope in our inventories with its own history, with its own processing requirements, with its own timestamps, things like that. Well, we need to be able to identify those assets first and foremost, and there's quite a few different strategies to mark or either label these scopes. So for example, here on the left, we see like barcodes. So that's pretty common. ScopeTrac Advanced uses barcodes, as well as there's other solutions out there as well. And so we use a barcode label that's serialized and attached to that scope. We can put that label where it makes the most sense. Sometimes scopes don't always, they don't have the right real estate to find a good spot for a label. But it's probably one of the most common ways that we can mark and individually designate a scope and be able to scan it using the tracking system. A new technology that's been emerging in this ability to track as well is RFID technology. So some of the scope models that have been coming out recently have RFID chips in them, and so what we've developed at Censis is a way that we can actually scan some of those. So what you see on the screen is an example of an RFID reading pad, which can be configured to read HF chips in the market. So if we happen to have scopes that have RFID chips or RFID chips embedded in them, and we have a compatible tracking solution with an RFID reader, that would keep us from having to barcode our stuff. We could simply use the RFID chips that come with these scopes already, configure our readers to read those, and that's a way that we could scan and track these scopes at various stages. And then lastly, this is also, this has been around for a while, but it's emerging more and more, is UDI marking with UDI, or unique device identification, with direct part marking. So these would be things like that little QR matrix we see in that image, a way that we can mark or etch individual scopes or assets. Some manufacturers are already releasing their scopes with things like this, much like the RFID chips. But there's also technologies and services out there that can mark these for us, and then we can scan them. ScopeTrac Advanced can also be compatible with QR marks, or data matrices, just like the one we see on the screen. So with the diverse array of scopes that we have, there's also a diverse way to mark them, track them, scan them, depending on what works best, what makes the most sense for us, what's the most affordable, what works with our tracking solutions. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about how we decide which one of these marking strategies to use, but it's important to note that there are quite a few out there, and it's important to have those conversations and discussions to determine what would be the best strategy. Now we're going to leverage some of that. So we've identified some challenges that we all face. We've looked at some ways that we can mark and scan these. And just to take a step back, whenever we do use a tracking solution like ScopeTrac Advanced, we would use one of these unique marks, whether it's a barcode, an RFID chip, a UDI mark, and we would scan those using a barcode scanning solution, and then scan them at various stages so we get real-time data, user data, timestamps, things like that. And with those challenges that we're all faced, with the abilities to mark and track each scope individually at every step of each scope's process, let's talk about how we can leverage that in accordance with the latest recommendations from ST91. So the first is like bedside, or point of use, or point of care. Once again, that word treatment, we're going to want to get that into our lexicon, go away from that cleaning or pre-cleaning, because treatment can include a wide variety or multitude of things. And using a tracking system is how we can go ahead and document each one of those situations. So you can scan to record that technician that's handling that scope. We can scan to record the scope itself, the procedure we're using that scope in, as well as the attending surgeon. There's all different types of, or physician, there's all different types of data that we might need to capture at this step based on what we're doing and what the scope model is and what's called for in its IFU. So being able to set up scan points, being able to interact with a solution that has functionality already built in to capture things like this, like the timestamp of point of use, treatment. These are all things that are going to help us document that these point of use and bedside events are occurring. It's going to be a way that we can quickly do it and go away from paper documentation. We'll have some conversations about the difference between, going electronic and going paper later, because there's a myriad of them. But being able to scan and document whatever happens at the bedside with point of use is going to be really valuable with the tracking system, because it takes away a lot of the challenges of the documentation that a lot of us are faced today. And another benefit there is one of the biggest challenges, honestly, is the reprocessing that we have to do, or the treatment that we do have to do based on the scope model. If we work at a large facility with a really diverse inventory of scopes, it's almost next to impossible to memorize 80 different IFUs or something. So having a tracking system that can show you IFUs, that can guide you, that can make that information just available right next to you, on a screen or on a mobile device, that's really valuable as well, because we want to make sure that the treatments that we're doing align with what that scope calls for in its IFU. The next section is manual clean. Now, we are going to talk about here in a little bit that we want to move away from manual cleaning as much as possible, but that doesn't mean it's going away completely. So we can't just ignore it. So whenever manual cleaning does occur, using a tracking system is going to help us in a lot of the same ways it helps us at the bedside. We're going to have asset-specific IFU access right on the screen there, either with IFUs that we've built in our own databases with our tracking solutions, or if we happen to have interfaces or integrations to like a third-party database like OneSource or something. Being able to have to quickly access those IFUs right when we need them is going to be really important for any cleaning, or really any stage of handling these assets. And we also want what we need to do in accordance with that IFU to be easy to interpret, to be easy to interact with, and to be easy to document. And when they're on the screen, we can do all of that almost simultaneously. We can have a screen up next to our cleaning sinks or our stations with the steps right there. We can go ahead and document those steps as we do them, and that would log timestamps, the user responsible, and all of that stuff gets saved in these tracking solutions. And then once we document and note all of these things that we're doing, whether, depending on what that scope model is, what's really important is that all of this is reportable. I have right there at the top, one of my colleagues always says that. If you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And so it's one thing to capture all this data. It's one thing to have all this data and IFU information at our fingertips. But if we can't show that we did it, if there's no way to prove that we did it, or report on what we did do, it's really shooting us in the foot here. We could have a perfect process, but if we can't prove that it's perfect, then that's going to be an issue all of its own. So being able to report all that data that we're documenting is just as important. And then when we talk about disinfection, once again, we're going to avoid manual cleaning as much as possible. So we're going to want to start using AERs more, if we're not already, we're going to want to use AERs for pretty much every scope or asset that we can that's capable. And what the data is showing is that these, of course, increase safety, they're increasing efficiency, and they're also reducing human errors, which any one of those is a challenge all of its own, right? But when you think about all three could happen at any given time. There's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of things that we're responsible for, and an AER is going to help reduce those stresses associated with those. And then, fortunately, a lot of these AERs integrate right into tracking solutions. So if we have an AER that can integrate with a tracking solution like ScopeTrac Advanced, it takes whole steps out of the process, because we would just conduct business as usual with the AER that we have. And then since it's integrated with a tracking solution, it would simply just shoot that information over digitally. So we would know the contents of those loads, we would know the cycle numbers, the operator information, things like that, without having to document that manually, digitally. So there's a lot of benefits to the AER, but the most important thing I feel is just the data is definitely showing that it's much more safe, and it's much more safe to utilize an AER to displace manual cleaning when possible. I'm gonna beat this horse dead throughout this entire presentation, but once again, all of this is always going to be dependent on that scope's IFU. So some IFUs, are all going to have their own recommendations and processes, but we want to start moving away from manual cleaning if and when possible for any of these scope models. And then when it comes to storage, once again, I mentioned this earlier, it's now, it's on paper, we need these scopes to be absolutely or completely dry prior to storage. So doing hang tests, drip tests, things like that, I've encountered those in the past, but now there's also going to be, there's now ways that ST91 is encouraging that these happen. So like active airflows with HEPA filters, things like that. We'll get into that conversation a little more. But storage it's really what happens before storage. We want to make sure that they're completely dry and that we have processes in place to make sure that these scopes are completely dry. We will have a Q&A there, but I just happened to see the latest, one of my latest questions has to do with that. As far as will there be a standard hang time, and that's coming from David Seward, I don't think so. I think what the data and what the industry is showing is that hang times are going to be really dependent on a lot of factors. So I don't think there's just going to be one set hang time for everybody. I think that's going to be dependent on the IFU. If it's in the IFU, you might even find that some IFUs don't state it. So taking a step back when it comes to the recommendations for storage and dry times, it's what's safe, but it's also what adheres to regulations, standards, and local guidelines. So a big piece of ST91, once again, is that flexibility that it's allowing us. So us in our own departments and facilities, we got to take all of this into consideration, what the data is showing, what ST91 is recommending, and then what we know just locally and from our own processes and our own inventories, what's going to make the most sense for our SOPs for storage and drying. So there's a lot of kind of research that goes into establishing what a dry time or hang time should be for your own inventories, but it's just being aware that whatever that process is that it's established, we need to make sure that those scopes are completely dry before we throw them into storage and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about the documentation and the benefit there. So all those challenges that we just discussed, and then how an electronic tracking system helps us mitigate some of those, just taking a step back and then thinking about all the other advantages as well. So not only is it going to give us IFUs, it's going to let us document things without having to interact with clipboards, paper records, things like that. There on the left is just a bulleted list of some electronic benefits. There on the right are just some paper situations. But I want to call out some of these specifically, because I think some of these we don't always think about whenever we're thinking about an electronic system. But specifically, I want to talk about how it's automated. That one is something I think we do think about, but we're not always aware of how far that automation goes. I think I even saw a question there just blip by for a second as far as how do the AER loads get automated. So there's a lot that can be automated now. So for example, those AER cycles. So we can integrate a AER to a tracking solution. And just by doing what we do normally with that machine, that AER, it's going to go ahead and create all that cycle information for us because we're inputting it there. But instead of having to do double work and write it down onto a clipboard or document it into a solution, since it's integrated with something like ScopeTrac Advanced, it would just shoot all that reprocessing data over for us. So it would create the cycles, it would document timestamps, operators, contents, things like that to include the scope model, serial number, all the checks in the boxes that we're typically having to do on paper. Or if we do have a tracking system and we have no integrations, we're still having to input that manually, like with a keyboard or something. So the automation of a lot of this data is really helpful. I think of it as, it may shave off seconds in a day, but what does that look like across a week? What does that look like across a month? And then the efficiency really starts to grow. Just, you don't have to add much time there to get those values. And then kind of about a third of the way down there, this is one that when I used to implement, I used to always talk about better legibility and tracking. I don't know if any of y'all had those experiences where you go back and you pull some old records and you can't read it, whether it was someone's handwriting or if it's just degraded. It might have gotten wet, it might have gotten moist, the paper might have torn, something like that. So that's always a key benefit of going electronic is you're going to be able to read it regardless of handwriting. And digital records can't, they don't degrade over time. Even some chemical indicators will just simply rot or degrade over time. So even if we store them for X amount of days, they might rot before we even get to that required, or they might degrade and fall apart before we get to that required retention period. So being able to read these records easily, being able to track them easily is a huge part of electronic tracking for each individual scope. And then second from the bottom there is another one I like to speak to, and that's education and competency verification. There are tracking systems and solutions out there that also include personnel consideration modules for like competencies and things. ScopeTrac Advanced is one of those. So we can actually build out competencies to match the scope models, and those are all scalable. You can build your competencies and your trainings, and then you can even weave in like safety features or stops. So if somebody doesn't have the right competency to handle a complex scope, is that something that we're going to want to incorporate into our processes? And then there on the right, that's just a handful of things that happen when we do have paper tracking. Paper can get contaminated. We run out of storage, but not only that, sometimes we have to pay for storage. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with Iron Mountain things. We might have to pay to actually have our records stored. And then what if you need to pull a record? What if I need a box from 2 years ago? That's a whole process of its own. And then not user-friendly, we might have tons of binders or boxes stacked on top of each other, missing or incomplete documentation, that handwriting's coming back, finding recall information. All of these are a lot quicker, a lot easier to access when they're all consolidated in a single electronic tracking solution. And it takes a lot of the headache away of showing that documentation or being able to review, QA check, reconcile, any of that documentation that we have. Just give me a second. All right, now, once again, let's circle back to this point of use treatment. Once again, treatment's that word that I'm going to keep saying over and over again, because that's really the biggest change here. Once again, like I mentioned, we want to go away from saying things like cleaning or pre-cleaning, because we don't want to, put any of this into a single bucket. We don't want to think that this process is just wiping it down or just cleaning it. Because based on that scope model, based on the process, based on the procedure, based on, once again, guideline standards, IFUs, that treatment can be a diverse array of things. It could be just cleaning. It really could. It could be cleaning and pre-cleaning. And let's not forget that a lot of scope models now are having accessories, disposable caps, things like that. And any scope that has accessories, whether they're disposable or not, also have its own considerations for what we do at the point of care or point of use. And then those inspections and preparations. I mentioned earlier, we should always be incorporating visual inspections. But what if that's something that we need to document during this treatment phase? What if for this scope model, there actually is a prep or visual inspection step that's called for? How do we document things like that? And then handoff, right? This documentation is always coming back. If we don't document it, it didn't happen. And what we find also a pretty common practice is the person that uses the scope in the room is probably not the person that's also cleaning and disinfecting these scopes for us. So making sure that we document what happened with this scope, we're logging timestamps, we're making sure that when they're prepared for proper transport, that we know when that step occurred and we know what its destination is and when it should get there and who should know what everything we just did and documented. So being able to document what we're doing as far as treatment goes, regardless of what that treatment might include, being able to make sure that all that information is logged, documented properly before we get to the next stages of reprocessing. And then moisture adherence for transport. Once again, ST91 also recommends, keeping our scopes moist, when it's appropriate for transport. And once again, that's not drowning these scopes. It's not completely submerging them, and it's certainly not letting them get dry. It's just kind of like that Goldilocks zone of how moist we should keep these scopes to keep them, in the right threshold from when we do use them to when we send them off to cleaning and disinfection. So just like I mentioned earlier, this is a lot of things to consider for our scopes, especially if you have a diverse inventory. Because your treatment, you could have 10 different scope models, and that means you can have 10 different treatment processes to consider. So making sure that we're aware of our scopes and what our IFUs are calling for, and what we as a local, facility or department, what do we want to incorporate to make sure that as an SOP or as a process that we are capturing the treatment, we're conducting the treatment that we're supposed to, but also just as importantly, we're documenting the treatment that we're conducting. And leveraging electronic tracking back to all of those point of uses. I think I just got a question. How does point of use treatment occur in the operating room? Yeah, kind of right on point here, Keisha. So I see variability there as far as point of use treatment and when it occurs, how it occurs, because once again, it varies. Some scopes we might be doing some point of use cleaning and steps in the operating room. We might have an ante room. We might have processes in place that would allow for this. But what's important is with a tracking system, regardless of what that treatment is, if it does occur in the operating room, we can really quickly document what we're doing. We can use scan points, we can use a scanner, and we can real-time capture and log the things that we're doing, in addition to have access to those IFUs. Because you got an IFU that a lot of us might be used to for like the cleaning and disinfection steps. But what's the IFU say for point of use? So we also need access to that information as well. And we need to be able to quickly access that. So being able to know what we need to do, being able to have a process in place, and then also using a scanning solution to track each individual scope as it goes through these steps, whether that's in the operating room or somewhere adjacent to it. Leveraging our tracking solutions are going to help us document and process correctly. Last thing there I want to mention is another integration we haven't really talked about yet is integrations with our scheduling platforms, our EMRs and EHRs. So things like our Epics and our Cerners and our SISs and things. So being able to integrate with those also helps leverage these point of use requirements and times, because we know when cases should be going, we know what scopes are available and when, things like that. So I always like to take a step back once again and remember that these processes that we want to establish are always going to be scope specific. It's always going to be what makes the most sense and what is the most safe for our departments. But regardless of what those decisions are made to be, the tracking solution is going to be pretty similar for everyone, because we're going to be able to leverage it to scale to whatever we're doing. So we can have as many scan points or as few scan points as required, and all of those are going to attach who's responsible for this with a timestamp. Things that we normally have clipboards all over the place. There's a couple modules that I would always talk about as like my clipboard killers, because it's always great to walk into a department and you see a clipboard for the eye wash station, and you see a clipboard for your filter changes, and you see a clipboard for your moisture sign-offs or things like that. So being able to leverage electronic tracking to consolidate all these processes, being able to quickly access the information, being able to integrate with our schedulers, these are all really good, valuable pieces that help us really make sure that we are totally tracking and properly processing all of our HLD assets. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about maintenance and repair now. This is almost a completely different challenge in my eyes. Once again, just like with the previous version of ST91, maintenance and damage and repair challenges are nothing new for any of us that handle, these sensitive assets, especially some of our flexible endoscopes and our semi-rigid scopes. You can crimp them really easily, or you can do it on accident. They can be mishandled, they can be misused by doctors, they can be dropped, they can be transported improperly. The list of things that could go wrong with a scope is almost infinite. But there are some really important questions that we always want to ask ourselves. And more importantly, we want to be able to put processes in place that help us identify those answers. And the first and foremost was, is this damage avoidable? That's always something that we can control in our departments. So being able to align the type of damage with what our, I don't want to say best guess, but what we know to be pretty standard. Like I can pretty much tell if someone slammed a cart door on a distal tip, right? It's one thing to have a little tear. It's another thing to be just completely 90-degreed and just broken. So being able to identify if the damages or things that we're encountering, are they avoidable? Was it processor or user error, or was it just normal wear and tear? And being able to identify those is important. Once again, and then some common reasons, that distal tip damage I just mentioned. Fluid invasion is, of course, a really common one. Insertion or use damage. And then that normal wear and tear. We could be perfectly kind to our scopes, but just over years of use, the harsh chemicals that are used during reprocessing, just handling, all of that, they will degrade over time. So it's one thing to know that we should have processes in place to identify when scopes are damaged, but it's also important to identify, are these avoidable? Is this just normal wear and tear? What am I going to do with what my tracking system is telling me? And so whenever we do have those processes in place, we're going to be able to know that because of everything else we've just talked about, we should have proper reprocessing. So we should have IFU access at various stages. Our end users should know how to properly handle whatever scope they're handling. But things happen. Like I said, I've seen all sorts of things happen to scopes. So we should have access to IFUs, right? But how do you know if something's actually damaged? I could have an IFU all day that tells me how to reprocess it. But if I'm focused on that, how do I know if something is even damaged or if I'm cleaning something properly? Because if it is damaged, that also makes it a lot harder to sterilize or high-level disinfect. So this comes back to those visual inspections. We can have electronic tracking solution. We can have technicians that have competencies and everything trained. But making sure that we actually are incorporating visual inspections as frequently and as often as possible, and making sure that we do have an enhanced visual inspection to include things like borescopes when appropriate. Because if we don't catch the problem, it's only going to get worse. So it's one thing to, have the struggles of just maintenance costs and repairs, but one of the trickiest parts too is incorporating, how do we document those? How do we catch those in time? And then how do we incorporate a tracking system to help us identify trends, to help us know if these things were avoidable? And electronic tracking solutions can do just that. In addition to, we can create quality events, we can have pictures of the scopes, we can even have like videos. So if we need an instructional video on how to properly aspirate, how to properly inspect, these are all materials and content that can be loaded into a tracking solution that is scope model specific. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal to help us not only incorporate a process or procedure to reduce, damages and errors, but also to capture that data and to make actionable decisions based off what the data is showing when it comes to maintenance and repairs. And so down there at the bottom, I just have a lot of the common things that we really should incorporate into these visual processes. So inspection, identification is one thing, inspection is another, and then enhanced visual inspection is almost another thing. Now, I mentioned earlier, I think visual inspections should almost just be, second, second nature for a lot of these scopes. If anytime I pick up a scope, I should probably always give it a couple once-overs, regardless of where I'm at in the process. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be documented every time, but I think it certainly is best practice to make sure that everyone knows we should always be looking at our scopes as if they're sensitive and delicate, because most of them are. We should almost always anticipate something to be damaged. That way we don't ever, they never slip through the cracks, so to speak. But enhanced visual inspection is kind of a multifaceted perspective. One, it's enhanced in the literal sense. We're going to be using things like a borescope to inspect those channels and things, as opposed to just using the naked eye. But enhanced to me also means we're also enhancing what we're capturing and documenting. So it's encouraged that if we do have enhanced visual inspections, that these are absolutely documented, right? This is woven into our documentation process. Not only did I, clean and disinfect this scope, but I also included, my CV testing, I documented that, and then I also included some enhanced visuals, inspections, and I documented that. So just run-of-the-mill visual inspections should be constant, but making sure that we're incorporating, when appropriate, an enhanced visual inspection and also documenting that with a tracking solution is going to be one of the things that was spoken to pretty heavily in the latest ST91. Now down below, I just have I think some of the most common damages or issues that we see when we do have these delicate scopes. Some of those are from damage. Some of them are just from normal wear and tear. But being able to recognize them is what's important. Once again, identification and inspection are two different things. We can inspect all day, but we have to be able to identify. So things like glue bands, making sure our glue bands aren't completely degraded, making sure that our tips are working. And then for those complex scopes, making sure that they have like elevator handles or mechanisms, if they have biopsy channels, if they have a lot of moving parts. We want to make sure that we know how to not only inspect, but identify when things are wrong with those complex pieces. No two scopes are the same. So being able to know what to look for is just as important as the actual looking, and then documenting those enhanced visual inspections are also just as important. Once again, if we don't document it, it didn't happen. This is just a nice, concise way to kind of step back and think about everything we've talked about. So if we move from paper to electronic tracking solution, whether we have one already or we just want to go more digital with some of our paper processes, it's going to eliminate a lot of that manual documentation. So that's the process of actually manually documenting it, but then also the challenges that coincide with the after the fact, pulling those records, being able to know where our records are, being able to review and audit them, being able to reconcile them. A lot of those problems almost go out the window with the electronic tracking solution. For example, at Censis, like we always tell our customers, you don't have any record retention concerns. We don't delete anything, so you never have to worry about like a scope reprocessing record from 6 years ago going anywhere or getting lost in a warehouse. All you have to do is type a few cycle numbers, and you can find what you need in just a few seconds. Then this is also going to help us mitigate any reprocessing errors. And it does that a few ways. One of the ways is letting us know what we need to know when we need to know it. So having IFUs pop up when we're reprocessing, having IFUs pop up when it's appropriate, when we're inspecting, things like that. But then also having things like those competencies or like personnel consideration features. Is the person handling the scope properly trained to handle it? Is everyone aware of our processes? Has everyone been signed off on our processes? Does everyone know what they're doing and what to document? Having a tracking system, once again, gives us reports to figure all that out pretty quickly. And then hands-free data entry. This is something I didn't talk about too much today, but there are strategies to go hands-free, using things like, for example, at Censis, we have like an antimicrobial foot pedal system that goes on the floor. And those foot pedals can correlate with buttons on the screen. So I can log in using an RFID badge. I can then scan a scope, and then I can start using foot pedals to reprocess without ever having to touch a keyboard or a mouse. And this helps us mitigate things like cross-contamination concerns, especially if we have a department where cleaning and disinfection happen adjacently. Having all of these benefits of hands-free is something we didn't really even talk about today. But it is something to consider because it's just one less thing to worry about. If I can use both hands to hold my scope, I'm not like juggling it and then using a mouse. It's just a lot safer and a lot easier for the technicians. And then there's also notifications, something else we didn't really talk about. But what if things, I don't want to say go wrong. I don't always want to focus on event negative. But if we do need to be notified if anything happens, if a reprocessor is down, if scopes, hang time has expired and we got to reprocess it, things like that, whatever it might be, Or those competencies. Do we want to know if somebody tried to do something that they weren't trained to do or signed off to do? Having automated notifications helps us catch things that we might not be aware of, as quickly or as soon as we should be. So in addition to everything else that we've talked about, being able to have those IFU access in place, being able to know what we need to do when we need to do it, and then being able to interface with AERs, being able to take a step back, identify our inventories, and then leverage an electronic tracking solution to be specific for each scope model at each process. A tracking system is going to be really helpful in these challenges. And then, yeah, that's right on time there, right about 45 minutes. I see I have quite a few questions, so I'm actually going to start moving through those if you all just give me a second. I always like questions.
Yeah, and Jacob, I can hop in there for you and mitigate those or moderate those questions if you'd like.
All right. Yeah, no problem.
One of the most interesting things that you talked about, obviously, is ST91, and I guess deciphering that entire document. My question would be: have you been able to get through it all? And
most of it,
because when it comes to tracking scopes and instruments and implementing a document like that, and then you've got the IFUs, right? So there's a lot of marrying up of information. How do you determine the best way to to bring those all together when it comes to tracking an instrument?
Yeah, so I think whenever it comes to ST91, really this comes to all of Amy's recommendations and standards, is the language. I always like to remind people, be really aware of the language in whatever section you're reading. There's a big difference between must and can or should. So being able to know the difference between something that says you should be doing this, or you shall do this, or you may do this, that's a really just probably the first stepping stone. Because if you misinterpret just one word, it can mean a whole world of difference for that process. But when it comes to our inventories, it's kind of a two-parter there. It's being familiar with what the guidelines are recommending and how to apply what they're recommending to what we have. But then the tricky part is also making sure that aligns with whatever local and regulatory guidelines that we adhere to as well. So that could be all the way from the FDA to like a local municipal guideline or something, or even just a campus guideline, a facility guideline. So there are a lot of challenges there, but I think just being comfortable understanding how ST91 communicates what it does is a big piece of it, because you can read it all day, and if we're not aware of those little nuances, it can kind of play folly with what our intentions are with that.
Right. Yeah, and I think you mentioned that it's a complete rewrite. So you've got the 2015 version, and everybody has probably just started to pull all of those in as best practice, and now you got the flip. And so I think there's also a real fine line between, marrying up older and just having that gradual adaptation of some of the newer practices and not stepping on the toes of what the facilities have implemented that has actually been working for them. So I've got a question here from Kimberly. Do you find that electronic tracking is cost effective for outpatient or small facilities?
Yeah, I actually really liked implementing at small facilities. So, I mean, it always depends on your inventories, but in the long run, it's always cost effective, because there's a lot of things that we don't even consider when we think about electronic tracking solution at first. I think when we think about costs or ROIs, I think the first value or the first quantities we always think of is how much is this going to cost my department? How much am I going to spend on this? And that's really easy to quantify, right? There's a price associated with those things usually. What's harder to quantify is what is the saving me in the long run? And when you are a smaller facility like an ASC or an outpatient clinic or just a specialty like endo or GI clinic, I really always like to think about it in the long run. It makes it, once you have a process in place, once you leverage a tracking solution, regardless if you have 10 scopes or 100, you're going to start to see the value when you start to realize that there's a lot of things that you no longer worry about. Like one of those, for example, is like the storage, storage costs and things like that. They might not be as expensive for a smaller facility, but that's just one piece of it. I have to pay someone to just hold paper for me. That's something that we wouldn't really have to worry about anymore. Also, there's just the training that goes along with it, the documentation, and then the time. The time it takes is a huge one that is really hard to quantify. How much time does it take me to do all of this on paper compared to how long does it take me to do this just with a few scans in a few seconds? Because what's really valuable, and it's hard to demonstrate with an actual demonstration if we haven't seen something like ScopeTrac Advanced, a lot of the things that we're required to document just happen kind of like ghosted in the background, like the timestamp associated with something. Normally that's something I have to write out. But if I just scan something or if I acknowledge a step, it's logged who did it, when they did it, what they did it on, and all of that gets done instantaneously without me having to do anything. So I mentioned earlier, like it may shave seconds or minutes off a day, but what does that make a week look like? What does that make a month look like? How many more procedures can I squeeze into a quarter based on that? Even if it's just a handful, that's a lot of money there that we might not quantify immediately because it's just not right in your face. But there's a lot of advantages to leveraging a tracking system for cost effectiveness. And then if it goes back to like, how we actually implement that, there's different strategies there too for cost considerations. Do I want to pay the price to have all of my scopes, individually marked with UDIs, or am I comfortable just using a barcode that's, $1 or so a piece? There's a lot of considerations there to really leverage the returns that we get on those investments. But I would always support the idea or the statement that it is cost effective regardless if you're tiny or if you're large. And I mentioned earlier, I used to love implementing like outpatient clinics and stuff because it was always a lot easier to make changes. It was always a lot easier to implement processes when you only have a handful of people that are all aware of the same inventory, the same 10 scopes. You hit the ground running a lot faster and you see a lot of benefit a lot quicker simply because the nature of implementation. It's a lot easier to implement at a smaller facility than it is when you have dozens and dozens of people that we all need to get on the same page across 4 different shifts. So I always really enjoyed implementing it like ASCs and outpatient clinics for that reason.
Yeah, I think another thing, and we touched on it in the last session with Tracy, is that you have the record keeping if Joint Commission shows up and you're not filtering through all kinds of folders and paper records and things like that. You can just pop it open and there it is. And I think that alleviates a lot of anxiety because it's living in one space. So I think a follow-up question, and this was one that I had, is how do you best implement a tracking program for a facility that's never used an electronic tracking system?
Yeah, that's another good one. Those were also some of my favorites to implement because I always liked the change in people's perspectives because it's really scary to have a process in place, one that everyone's comfortable with, one that we all understand, and then to completely turn it on its head. Right? All the stuff that we're doing, we're just not going to do anymore. So we at Censis, we have quite a few strategies to make sure that goes smoothly. One of the things is to make sure that whenever we do implement, we're not like we don't come in with a sledgehammer. We custom tailor each implementation to match that specific campus. So how many end users do you have? How does that diversify, right? How many out of those end users, who's responsible for what? And then, how many rooms do you have? What is your scope inventories? We ask a lot of questions, weeks before we even get on site, because we want to make sure that the solution that we put in place matches what's there. So we don't just come in with a bunch of assumptions. We actually do the complete opposite. Honestly, if you ask some of our customers, we're probably pretty annoying with some of our questions. But it really is to just get a really good understanding of what your department's like and how best to implement, especially if we're coming from paper. And then when I would implement that, one of the challenges is, of course, getting used to doing 2 processes. Right? I'm used to logging something on paper, but now I have to do this completely other thing. So there is double work there. There is kind of a transition period where, for safety and safety and process concerns, we do it on paper still because everyone's used to that. We're comfortable knowing we're documenting properly that way, and then we're also transitioning to a tracking system. So just like we collect data, just like we custom tailor those implementations, another thing that we always, another motive of ours, is to always make sure that we crawl, walk, run. I don't show up on day one and teach someone how to do every single module. I don't expect someone to use all the advanced modules. We really make sure that what's the most important that we want to capture, right? Point of use treatments, utilization, traceability to the patient, proper reprocessing, the big heavy hitters. And so easing in, day by day, we learn a module by day. We slowly displace what we're doing on paper. And I mentioned I used to love implementing those situations too, because I always get a lot of funny looks on day one of implementation. Like, who's this guy coming in here that's going to turn my department on its head? And then by the second Thursday or Friday, that feeling was almost completely gone, pretty much every single time. Because when you realize, I don't have to fill out this clipboard every day anymore. Like, I don't have to keep a pen on me, or like have to keep a watch that I keep here and a watch that I keep at home. A lot of little things like that people start to realize, and it was always really fun to watch that transition from kind of apprehension to acceptance to actually preference. But there are challenges. I'd be lying if I said it was easy. But we once again, our professional services and implementation teams, that's exactly what they do, is they make sure that we tailor what we do to your process.
Awesome. So you're not saying you just walk in and you plug it in and you walk away and say, you guys are good. Give us a call if anything happens.
You can still call us afterwards, but there's a little more to it than that.
Right. Well, you talked a little bit more, a lot about the automation process, and you focused on the AERs, and as you know, with scope cleaning, there are a ton of steps that are associated from when you go from bedside treatment, as we want to be calling it now, all the way to disinfection and HLD and sterilization to drying, everything. This one comes from John. When you say use the AER instead of manual cleaning, is it suggesting there is no manual sink cleaning, brushing, and decon? And do you go from bedside directly to the AER? I mean, this goes a little bit away from the tracking process, but you could probably marry up that question with how to, document that with the tracking.
Yeah. So if I was a little vague there, or it was confusing, I wouldn't doubt it. I can be. We don't want to completely get rid of manual cleaning if it's not appropriate. Once again, one of the big motives of the latest ST91 is to go in this with a much more flexible mindset. So it always boils down to what's that scope's IFU say. That's always kind of the Bible here. If the scope still requires manual cleaning, if these are processes that are needed for those models, we're going to want to do it. We're not going to want to rely on manual cleaning alone ever, though. We're always going to have to incorporate an AER when possible. So I don't want us to have this perception that we can just skip manual cleaning. We no longer have to do those steps. It's always going to fall back on that scope. But what we do want to encourage is AER utilization as often and as frequently as possible when we can, which has its own challenges too. But what we find is that if you do your manual cleaning properly and incorporating AER, all the data is showing that it's a lot safer. The scopes are coming out a lot safer. Technicians are having to do less and get more when we utilize AERs and like that. So it's always going to boil back down to what do I need to do based on the scope's IFU? And something I mentioned briefly is also IFUs vary greatly. Some IFUs are like 100 pages long, and some are like 5 pages long. So that's a challenge in and of itself too, right? What if this IFU is really specific and this one is really vague? That's where we have to take a step back and use what we know, use what other guidelines and other standards and other research is showing, and what we want to do at our facility. So there really is no one size fits all answer to some of these questions, because it's always going to boil down. I think that's the whole point. Is ST91 has to be flexible to accommodate for everyone's differences. Even though we might all have the same challenges and similarities, everyone's going to have a little bit of variation. And building out our processes and establishing those is going to be specific to all of us based on our scopes and our AERs and our processes and things.
Right. Yeah. And coming from my side of things, when I was working on the chemical side, I was a big proponent. I actually went into the facilities with the whole goal of training, point of use, best practice, and bedside cleaning, bedside treatment for scopes was a big one, but then there was a little bit of a gap when it came to who is responsible for this. There's always that $1 million question, and I think you talk about the golden hour that's always spoken of in the industry. If you have a tracking system and you're doing it at bedside, I think that those really can help line out who is responsible, and you can really define those processes. So that's, to me, it's something that when it comes to cleaning and scopes in particular, because there are so many issues, you really do need to have those steps lined out. And if you're tracking them, then the responsibility is actually just given to the people that need to be doing it. So that's great. We've got about a minute here, but I want to get to this one last one. If we already have a tracking system, is it possible to go paperless without purchasing a completely new tracking system and just get an upgrade?
I guess that depends on what your tracking system is and what you're trying to capture.
Right.
There's a lot of variability in what solutions on the market offer. And then I would always compare that to what you want to go paperless with. We can always get creative, especially like the ScopeTrac Advanced. There's a lot of scalable modules there that I mentioned earlier. I would always use the word like clipboard killer, because we can use the functionality that's in place, but then we can use other modules like quality event reporting. You can use like a quality event module to document things like our eye wash checks or our shower checks. We can also do things like we can treat things like a drying cabinet that has filter changes. Why don't we just scan whenever we change the filter instead of filling out a clipboard? So one, it varies. I guess the answer is variable there based on what your solution is today, what it's capable of, and then what you want to go paperless with. Because I try, and that's one of my motives, especially when I implement, is to go paperless as much as possible. But yeah, there's a lot of variability there.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we are at time, and there are a number of product-related questions specific to some of the Censis products, Jacob, that you can probably answer offline. And definitely, we will share Jacob's information. It's already included on the front screen there. But if there are any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Jacob. He's available to answer any other follow-up questions that may come up, especially for those of you that may be watching on demand. So Jacob, thanks a lot, man. This has been really informative, great presentation, a lot of good information. And I think you opened up a little bit of a new realm of discussion when it comes to ST91, which is, I think, going to be the big topic coming up the rest of this year.
Yeah. Agreed. But thank you for that, Brett. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. I greatly appreciate your time.
All right. So just wanted to once again say to everybody out there, if you do have any questions we weren't able to get to, you can also contact Jacob via email, and he'll gladly answer those. Just a reminder, there's going to be a short 15-minute break before the next session. And thanks again for joining us today. We've got a bunch more coming at you, so stay tuned, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.